You wake up in Athens, 432 BC. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, you're alive, and there's a lot around you that could kill you in the next few hours. The smell of olives and barley bread fills the air, mixed with the sharp scent of lamp oil burned all night. Your bed is just a thin mat on a hard wooden frame. No soft mattress or pillows like you're used to. When you open your eyes, you see rough stone walls covered in peeling whitewash. The floor beneath your bare feet is packed dirt, cold and uneven. No bathroom, no shower, no running water. And that's just the start of your day. Your first challenge is already waiting. Surviving in a world without painkillers, antibiotics, clean drinking water, or any of the thousands of conveniences you take for granted today. Welcome to ancient Greece, a place glamorized in movies and books, but one that would push your modern body and mind to the limit. Most people wouldn't last a full day. The sounds of morning in Greece fill your ears. Roosters crowing, merchants shouting out their goods in the streets nearby, the metallic clanging of tools in artisan workshops. No sirens, engines, phone alerts, or any of the usual city noise you're used to. Only natural sounds, people and animals, but still harsh to ears accustomed to quiet, soundproofed spaces. The air carries strong smells. There are no proper sewage systems, no trash pickup, no sanitation controls. The scent of human and animal waste mixes with rotting food, leather being tanned, and fabrics dyed with fermented urine, a common ingredient for dyes. Your modern nose, used to deodorized and sanitized places, would be overwhelmed by this constant assault on your senses. You get up, every muscle protesting. The mat you slept on didn't support your spine properly. Without ergonomic mattresses, comfy pillows, or adjustable firmness, your body starts the day already aching. Back, neck, and joints all sore. Physical discomfort would be a constant in ancient Greece. It's 5 a.m. and you should already be up and moving. The neighborhood rooster won't let you sleep past dawn. Your mouth is dry, teeth hurting. Your whole body's still sore from the night. Thirst hits. You can forget about just turning on a faucet. Water comes from wells or public fountains, and you have to walk to get it. But beware, this water isn't treated. It's full of bacteria and parasites your modern gut isn't ready to handle. A simple morning drink could land you with dysentery. The water you draw looks cloudy, with particles floating in it. You hesitate, but thirst wins. In ancient Greece, drinking clean water was rare. Most people mixed wine with water, not just for taste, but because the alcohol helped kill some germs. Still, waterborne diseases were common and a leading cause of death, especially in children. Brushing your teeth, forget toothpaste. Athenians chewed sticks into brushes and cleaned their mouths with mixtures of ashes, charcoal, and herbs. Bad breath was so normal no one even noticed it. That's just how people smelled. Your teeth already start to complain. Without modern dental care, even a small cavity or gum infection could easily turn into a serious problem, painful abscesses, or losing a tooth. Toothaches were so common back then they show up in medical and literary texts. Hippocrates, the famous Greek doctor, wrote about dental treatments like burning spots with hot irons and pulling teeth without any anesthesia. Breakfast is simple. Hard barley bread, a few olives, maybe some dried figs. If you're lucky, no coffee to wake you up, no refined sugar for energy. Honey was a luxury for special occasions or the wealthy. The bread you eat barely resembles the soft, fluffy stuff we know today. It's dense, coarse, often full of impurities. Tiny stones from milling, insect parts, even rodent droppings that got into the grain during storage. Your teeth, already weakened by poor hygiene, would take a beating from this abrasive diet. and don't expect variety. Most everyday Athenians ate pretty much the same thing daily: bread, olives, sometimes fish and seasonal veggies. Meat was a treat, saved for religious festivals when sacrificed animals were shared. Your modern taste buds, used to bold flavors and processed foods, would find this diet bland and boring. The idea of a big breakfast was almost unknown. Ancient Greeks usually had just 2 meals: a light snack in the morning and the main meal late afternoon. Going hungry for part of the day was normal, not unusual. Your metabolism, used to steady sugar and snacks, would protest fast. Flies are already buzzing around your food. No refrigeration. Food is preserved with salt, oil, vinegar, or eaten before it spoils. Without window screens or bug spray, insects are constant dinner guests. Insects aren't just annoying. They spread disease. Flies carry bacteria from waste to food, causing stomach illnesses. Mosquitoes spread malaria, common in many parts of ancient Greece, especially marshy areas. Malaria was so widespread many Greeks lived with it, suffering repeated fevers, chills, and severe anemia that slowly drained their health. Time to get dressed. Forget comfy jeans or soft cotton underwear. Men and women wear chitons, simple linen or wool tunics depending on the season. In summer, the Mediterranean heat makes you sweat, and the rough fabric irritates your skin. In winter, the thin clothes don't keep out the cold. Ancient Greek clothing wasn't just uncomfortable by today's standards. It was expensive and took a lot of work to make. Fabric was handmade, from spinning fiber to weaving cloth. One garment could take months to make, so most people owned very few clothes. You'd wear the same tunic for days or weeks, collecting sweat, dirt, and parasites like lice and fleas. Clothes were rarely washed the way we wash today. There was no soap like we know it, only alkaline substances from ashes or fermented urine that wore out fabric with regular use. Washing clothes meant soaking them in usually cold water and then beating the fabric against stones, a process that quickly wore the material out. Get ready, because your feet are about to face a whole new level of discomfort. Sandals were made from raw leather, without the cushioned soles we're used to today. The streets were dirt or uneven stones, so every step required care to avoid stepping in the piles of human and animal waste that filled the alleys. Ancient shoes didn't come in standard sizes, and they didn't differentiate between right and left feet. Sandals were basically identical, and you just picked which foot to put each one on. The result? Constant discomfort, blisters, calluses, and foot deformities. Over time, many Greeks, especially the poor, went barefoot most of the time, exposing themselves to parasites like hookworms that entered through the skin and caused chronic anemia. The city's streets weren't planned. They grew naturally over centuries, forming narrow, winding, and often steep alleys that turned into mud pits when it rained, and kicked up choking clouds of dust when it was dry. Navigating this terrain would be a non-stop challenge if you're used to flat sidewalks and paved roads. Now, it's time to work. If you're a man and a citizen, you might be lucky enough to take part in debates at the agora or assembly, but for most, including you, the day will be filled with hard labor. The idea of work was very different in ancient Greece. There were no formal contracts, no minimum wage, no set work hours, no unemployment benefits, and no retirement plans. For most people, work meant long hours of physical effort from sunrise to sunset, with little protection against exploitation or accidents. If you were a city worker, you might be a craftsman, potter, blacksmith, carpenter, or weaver. These trades, often romanticized today, involved brutal conditions. Extreme heat from furnaces and forges, dust that damaged lungs, and toxic chemicals like lead and mercury used without any safety gear. Heavy, dangerous tools caused frequent injuries. Maybe you were a merchant spending the day in the busy market, haggling without calculators, printed receipts, or written contracts. Every calculation was done mentally or with simple counting tools like a beishi. Commercial disputes were often settled by force or social pressure rather than by formal legal systems. If you were a woman, your role was mostly limited to the home, spinning, cooking, and taking care of children. You had no political voice. Your opinions rarely mattered outside the household. The freedoms you know today would have been unthinkable back then. Athenian women's lives were especially restricted, even by ancient standards. Respectable women rarely appeared in public alone. Their social value was tied to their chastity and ability to have children. Marriages usually happened in adolescence to much older men chosen by the family. The idea of consent as we understand it today wasn't really a thing. Household work was far from simple. Grinding grains to make flour took hours of hard physical labor every day. Cooking meant dealing with wood-fired stoves in spaces without ventilation, constantly breathing in smoke. Washing clothes and dishes meant carrying water from often faraway public sources. Pregnancy and childbirth were incredibly risky. Without modern medical help, antibiotics, or safe C-sections, childbirth was a leading cause of death for mothers. Complications like heavy bleeding, infections, or unusual fetal positions often ended tragically for both mother and baby. Midwives were skilled, but had very limited resources to handle emergencies. The sun is already high, and your modern body, used to air conditioning, is starting to protest. There's no sunscreen, no sunglasses for your sensitive eyes. Sweat mixes with dust, creating an uncomfortable paste that sticks to your skin. The Mediterranean climate, often romanticized as always pleasant, had serious challenges. Summers were brutally hot, often hitting over 100 degrees and 40 degrees in July and August. Heat stroke was a real danger, especially for workers who had to be outside during the hottest hours, without any understanding of heat-related illnesses. Many worked until they physically collapsed. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable. It was deadly. Severe dehydration, especially among the elderly and children, could quickly lead to death. Without knowledge of electrolytes or proper hydration, people only drank when thirsty, often already badly dehydrated. Constant sun exposure caused visible damage. Outdoor workers' skin aged early, becoming leathery and deeply wrinkled from a young age. Eye problems like cataracts were very common, often causing partial or total blindness relatively early, and it's not even noon yet. The hours drag on, testing your physical and mental endurance. The heat gets worse. Thirst becomes unbearable. Tasks that are easy today, reading, simple math, remembering things, get harder as your body fights the harsh conditions. Your brain, used to comfort, steady glucose, and hydration, starts to fail. You lose focus, get irritable, and make worse decisions. This state, which today would be temporary and fixable, was your everyday reality in ancient Greece. It's noon. The sun is ruthless, especially in the Mediterranean summer. Temperatures easily hit 95 degrees to 35 degrees or more. No air conditioning, no fans, no glass windows to block the heat. Lunch breaks, as we know them, didn't exist. Instead, the workday usually paused during the hottest hours. Not for comfort, but because you physically had to. Working under the midday sun was almost impossible. The siesta wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Thirst is constant. Do you drink water or watered-down wine? Yes, wine. Because even unsafe water is less risky when mixed with alcohol. But Greek wine was nothing like what you know. It was more sour, often mixed with pine resin, called retsina, a flavor your modern palate would probably find medicinal and unpleasant. Wine wasn't just a treat or luxury, it was a public health necessity. Fermentation killed some germs, making wine often safer than water. Kids started drinking watered-down wine early, building up a tolerance from childhood. Undiluted wine was seen as wild and dangerous, linked to reckless behavior and losing control. Winemaking back then was very different from what we know today. Grapes were crushed by foot in big vats, fermented with wild yeasts, and stored in ceramic jars sealed with pine resin, which gave the wine its unique flavor. To a modern wine lover, it would be almost unrecognizable, more acidic, rougher, with strong resin notes and often containing bits of sediment. For lunch, many ate outside. Market vendors sold bread, olives, goat cheese, and sometimes salted fish. There were no restaurants like we have now, just simple stalls where you could grab food to eat, standing up or take away. Street food was a crucial part of city life, especially for workers living in small rooms without kitchens. It was their main source of meals. Vendors offered bread with legume-based sauces like olive tapenade, soups made from lentils or chickpeas, small fried fish eaten whole, bones and all, and sometimes meat skewers from animals sacrificed in religious ceremonies. Preserving food was tricky but creative. Fish was often salted or fermented into sauces like garum, a paste made from fish guts fermented in brine under the sun. It was a very popular seasoning, but its smell would be awful to modern noses. Cheese helped preserve milk that would spoil fast in the heat. Fruits were dried in the sun to concentrate sugars and store them for months. Flies were constant companions. There was no food safety inspection or regulations. Food was handled by unwashed hands, left exposed in the hot sun. Food poisoning was so common, it was just accepted as a part of life. The idea of food hygiene as we know it didn't exist. No one understood germs. Cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods was constant. Utensils were rarely cleaned properly. Sick food handlers kept working, spreading germs. Foodborne illnesses happened so often they were just seen as normal. Chronic or recurring diarrhea was so common it was rarely treated as a medical problem, just part of everyday life. Your modern digestive system, without the gradual exposure that builds tolerance, would be especially vulnerable. The midday heat is intense, and many seek shade. This is the siesta, not laziness but survival. Working under this sun risks heat stroke and dehydration. Your modern body, used to controlled climates, would show heat exhaustion symptoms long before an ancient Greeks would. Adapting to extreme heat takes weeks or months. Your body hasn't developed the needed traits. Sweating more, making sweat less salty to save electrolytes, or cardiovascular changes to control body temperature. Early signs of heat exhaustion include dizziness, nausea, confusion, and muscle cramps. During rest, many Greeks found shade in public walkways, under trees, or inside their homes. Houses were built for the climate, thick walls to keep heat out, few south-facing windows and inner courtyards that stayed cooler. Still, comfort was nowhere near what we're used to. Your skin is already sunburned, your head pounds, and your muscles ache from unfamiliar labor, and you're only halfway through your first day. Sunburn wasn't just annoying, it caused lasting damage, speeding skin aging and raising the risk of serious issues. Skin cancer was likely common, though rarely diagnosed as such. Lesions we'd call melanomas or carcinomas today were just seen as stubborn wounds or ulcers. The constant headache from dehydration, sun, and hard work was treated with limited remedies. Herbal teas like chamomile or valerian, cold compresses when available, or simply stoic acceptance of pain as normal. Muscle fatigue would hit especially hard if you're used to sitting at a desk and working out occasionally in air-conditioned gyms. Your muscles would rebel violently. Lactic acid would build up, causing intense pain that could last days. Naturally, your body will demand relief. And here, maybe more than anywhere else, life in ancient Greece tests your modern limits. Privacy during bathroom use is mostly a modern idea. Back then, going to the bathroom, especially for men, was often a social event. Public latrines weren't just for relieving yourself. They were places to socialize, talk politics, and even do business. In the simplest homes, a chamber pot, a basic ceramic bowl, was all you had. No flushing, no toilet paper, no privacy. In the morning, chamber pot contents were dumped into the street or pits. Waste management was crude. In crowded cities, people often threw waste out windows or doors, with shouted warnings to passers-by. Some fancier buildings had cesspits, basically cesspools, that filled up and were emptied by workers, often slaves, who hauled the waste out. Some Greek cities had surprisingly advanced drainage for the time. Channels under streets to carry rainwater and some waste away. But these weren't modern sewers. They were open, untreated, and often overflowed in heavy rains, spreading contamination. In bigger cities, public latrines had stone benches with holes side by side and no dividers. You'd relieve yourself chatting with strangers just inches away. Running water, if any, was minimal, no toilet paper either. Instead, people used small smooth stones, sea sponges soaked in vinegar solution shared among users, or just water and the left hand, which is why using that hand for eating is considered rude. More advanced public latrines in some larger cities or important buildings had a channel of flowing water beneath the seats to carry waste away. But that water was rarely fresh. It often had already been used for other things, like filling public baths before being reused for flushing. Cleaning up after using the latrine was a real challenge. A sea sponge on a stick, called a chilospongio, was commonly used in public latrines. This sponge was shared by everyone, and only briefly rinsed in a bucket of water or vinegar between uses. A total germ nightmare by today's standards. In private homes, people used broken pottery shards, leaves, moss, or simply the left hand and water. With such primitive sanitation, it's no surprise that city streets smelled awful, especially in poorer areas. Stomach and intestinal diseases were everywhere. Almost every ancient Greek had some kind of intestinal parasite. Studies of fossilized feces show that nearly everyone carried worms or parasites. This had a huge impact on public health. Waterborne diseases caused by fecal contamination, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, polio, were common. Outbreaks happened regularly, especially during hot summers when bacteria multiplied fast and clean water was scarce. Parasites like tapeworms, pinworms, and hookworms were so widespread, they were probably seen as normal rather than illnesses. These parasites drained nutrients, causing chronic anemia, malnutrition, and stunted growth, especially in kids. Your modern digestive system, used to treated water and inspected food, would be in for a rough time. Dysentery would be almost guaranteed early on. Without modern medicine, even simple diarrhea could be deadly from dehydration. Dysentery wasn't just an annoyance, it was a killer. Rapid fluid loss could lead to death in days, especially for children and the elderly. Treatments available: herbal teas with astringent properties, mixtures of wine and honey, pomegranate preparations, did little against the actual bacteria. To make things worse, oral rehydration therapy was unknown. People with diarrhea were often told to avoid liquids, wrongly believing that would stop the diarrhea, exactly the opposite of what was needed. This made dehydration worse and more often fatal. The sanitation nightmare didn't stop there. Without proper sewer systems, drinking water was often contaminated. Flies moved freely between feces and food. Rats and other disease carriers thrived in cities. Contaminated water was a vicious cycle. Wells and springs were often dangerously close to cesspools and waste dumps. Contaminants seeped through the soil straight into drinking water. Heavy rains spread fecal matter from one place to another, polluting even supposedly clean sources. Rodents were everywhere in cities. Besides ruining and contaminating stored food, they carried diseases like plague, leptospirosis, and typhus. Pest control was basic. Cats hunted rats and simple traps were used. But rats were still everywhere. Your modern body, protected by generations of basic sanitation, would be an easy target for these pathogens. Immunity to local germs builds over a lifetime, starting in childhood. An ancient Greek, exposed from birth to local bacteria, viruses, and parasites, developed some resistance. Not full immunity, but enough to survive infections that could easily overwhelm a foreigner. Your modern body, by contrast, would be like virgin ground for these germs. No antibodies, no immune memory, no adaptations honed over generations. What a local might survive as a mild illness could turn into a serious, even fatal infection for you. As afternoon goes on, work continues. Your back aches from physical labor you're not used to. Your feet are raw from primitive sandals and rough streets. Small cuts and scrapes you'd normally ignore start causing problems in a world without antiseptics. Bone and joint problems were very common. Archaeological evidence shows wear and tear from intense repetitive labor. Early arthritis, herniated discs, joint deformities. These were seen as just normal aging, not medical problems. Chronic pain was part of daily life, with no effective painkillers beyond alcohol, and a few herbs with limited effects. People accepted levels of pain that would be unbearable today. Enduring pain was seen as a virtue, not something to be treated. Every small wound risked infection. No hydrogen peroxide, no antibiotics, no sterile bandages. A simple cut could easily turn deadly. The idea of cleanliness to prevent infection didn't exist. Wounds were treated with whatever was on hand: wine, vinegar, honey, herbal eye washes, even urine, some of which had mild antiseptic effects. But these treatments were often applied with dirty hands and contaminated cloths. Gangrene and sepsis were common outcomes from relatively minor injuries. A cut on the leg while working in the fields could get infected and lead to death within days. Puncture wounds, like from nails or thorns, were especially dangerous because of tetanus, almost always fatal before antibiotics. If you got seriously sick or injured, Greek medicine, advanced for its time, relied on the theory of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments often included bloodletting to rebalance these humors, which weakened already sick patients. The humor theory, developed by Hippocrates and followers, dominated Greek medicine. Disease was seen as an imbalance among these 4 fluids, each linked to qualities like hot, cold, dry, or moist. Doctors aimed to restore balance, often with harmful results. Bloodletting, cutting veins, or applying leeches was common for many conditions, but often made patients weaker by causing anemia when they needed strength to fight infection. Greek medicine had some surprisingly advanced features: careful observation and documentation of symptoms, recognizing the importance of diet and exercise for health, and a strong emphasis on medical ethics, like the famous Hippocratic Oath. These were real breakthroughs. But without knowledge of germs, microscopes to spot parasites, or chemistry to create effective medicines, even the most skilled doctors had very limited tools. Surgical instruments were basic: knives, saws, needles, at best sterilized with wine or vinegar. There was no anesthesia beyond alcohol and a few mildly sedating herbs. Surgery was an unbearably painful ordeal, with a high risk of death from shock or infection afterward. Operations were done with patients fully awake, often held down by strong assistants. Speed was critical. A skilled surgeon had to finish quickly. Amputations in minutes, to reduce the chance of death from shock. The pain was so intense that many patients died just from the trauma. Survival rates for complex surgeries beyond simple abscess drainage were extremely low. Shock, bleeding, and infection often made surgeries fatal rather than life-saving. Internal surgeries, anything opening the abdomen, chest, or skull, were especially risky, with death rates close to 100% for many cases. Some herbal remedies really did help. Willow bark contains compounds similar to aspirin. Certain plants had mild antibiotic effects, but for every helpful treatment there were dozens based on superstition or false assumptions. Greek herbal medicine was surprisingly sophisticated in some ways. Doctors and herbalists knew hundreds of medicinal plants, many later confirmed by science. Willow bark's salicylates helped with pain and fever. Garlic had antibacterial properties. St. John's wort was used for depression, all showing some success. Still, superstition and wrong ideas often got in the way. The doctrine of signatures, for example, claimed plants that looked like body parts could cure diseases of those parts, a false belief leading to ineffective treatments. Dosing was guesswork without modern chemistry. Plants of the same species varied wildly in strength depending on soil, climate, and harvest time. Some remedies contained toxic substances like lead, mercury, or arsenic, causing chronic poisoning in patients who thought they were being cured. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, you get a sharp toothache. Today, you'd visit the dentist, get local anesthesia, and a relatively painless fix. In ancient Greece, tooth pain was one of the most feared ailments, with no understanding that decay was caused by bacteria. They believed tooth worms, tiny imaginary creatures, bored into teeth, causing excruciating pain. The dentist, often the same guy who cut hair and did bloodletting, would pull the painful tooth with crude forceps, no anesthesia. Or you could try herbal poultices, strong wine, or just wait for the tooth to rot out. Extractions with crude tools often broke the tooth, leaving fragments behind that caused infection. No X-rays or special instruments existed. Brute force was the main method, causing trauma to surrounding tissue. For those who could afford it, there were crude attempts at dental restoration. Artificial teeth made from bone, wood, or human teeth taken from corpses, tied to remaining teeth with gold wire. Cavities might be filled with beeswax, resin, or even lead, mostly ineffective and sometimes toxic. It's no surprise many Greeks died young from dental infections, abscesses spreading to the brain or bloodstream, leading to sepsis. The link between mouth and body wasn't understood. Untreated dental infections easily spread via blood, causing heart infections, brain abscesses, or widespread sepsis. These complications, almost always fatal before antibiotics, often began as simple untreated cavities. Tooth loss was seen as normal aging. Many Greeks lost most of their teeth before 40, hurting nutrition and overall health. Poor chewing from missing teeth reduced nutrient absorption, contributing to chronic deficiencies in the elderly. Your head throbs, maybe from heat, dehydration, or the stress of navigating this harsh world. There were no modern painkillers, no ibuprofen or acetaminophen. You might chew bay leaves or drink valerian tea, but relief was minimal. Headaches were so common, they were just accepted as part of life, not a medical problem to treat. Migraines, chronic tension headaches, or headaches from undiagnosed eye issues were endured stoically or treated with weak remedies. Treatments ranged from cold compresses, temple massages with aromatic oils, to sedative herbs like valerian or chamomile. Some doctors even recommended leeches on the temples to drain blood, a painful and useless treatment based on wrong humoral theory. For severe head injuries, Greek doctors sometimes did trepanation, drilling or scraping a hole in the skull. This brutal surgery, done without anesthesia or brain knowledge, often caused permanent brain damage or death. And the day is far from over. The afternoon hours drag on, each moment a struggle against growing physical and mental exhaustion. Your body, already worn out from the tough morning, now feels the weight of cumulative fatigue. Muscles you rarely use in modern life burn with lactic acid. Your joints ache from repetitive movements they aren't used to. Dehydration worsens, bringing on pounding headaches and increasing confusion. On top of that, the language barrier is a major challenge. Even if you studied classical Greek, the way it's pronounced in schools today is very different from how the ancients actually spoke. Add in regional dialects, and communicating becomes even tougher. Not being able to express basic needs or understand instructions would skyrocket your stress levels. The sun sets over the city, casting long shadows. You might think the worst is behind you, but night in ancient Greece has its own dangers. With no electric lights, sunset meant a drastic change. Darkness transformed cities and villages. Most outdoor activities, work, business, travel, stopped since they relied entirely on daylight. Streets were pitch dark. There were no street lamps, only the occasional oil lamp inside a home or shop. The darkness would feel intense and unsettling if you are used to cities that never sleep, glowing with artificial light all night. Public lighting as we know it didn't really exist. Some temples or important buildings kept oil lamps burning part of the night, but those barely gave off more light than a single candle, easily snuffed out by wind. Getting around at night meant knowing the city inside and out, or carrying a small lantern, clay or metal containers with a wick and oil that gave off weak, flickering light, easy to blow out by wind or rain. Those lanterns were also fire hazards, especially in cities made mostly of wood. You'd have to carefully navigate narrow, dark alleys where thieves and criminals lurked in the shadows. There were no police like we have today. Public safety was minimal. In Athens, a small group of slave overseers called the Scythian archers acted like a makeshift police force. But their main job was keeping order in the assembly, not protecting everyday citizens. Crime was a constant reality, especially after dark. Without proper lighting, ID systems, or professional cops, criminals had a free hand at night. Robberies, muggings, and violence were so common that many people just avoided going out after sunset. The Scythian archers were foreign slaves hired because they didn't speak Greek well and had no local ties, which supposedly made them impartial. But that also limited their ability to investigate crimes or connect with victims and witnesses. Their role was mostly crowd control in public spaces, not crime fighting. Justice was inconsistent and often depended on social status. Wealthy citizens with political connections could get away with serious offenses, while foreigners or lower-class people faced harsh punishments for minor infractions. The idea of equality before the law existed in theory, especially in Athens, but rarely in practice. As the workday ended, men gathered at symposia, social events where wine flowed freely. These weren't the elegant philosophical debates you might imagine. Sure, some educated folks engaged in serious discussion, but for many, it was just an excuse to get drunk, with all the chaos that came with it. The symposium, literally drinking together, was a core social institution for male citizens. These parties were held in fancy rooms of the wealthiest homes, where guests reclined on couches arranged in a horseshoe shape. Slaves served wine, diluted with water in proportions controlled by the symposiarch, the evening's appointed leader. While literature often idealizes symposia as occasions for deep philosophical talk, most probably involved plenty of drinking, rowdiness, and even fights. Drinking games, performances by musicians and dancers, often slaves or courtesans, and competitions were all part of the scene. Public drunkenness was a tricky thing. Condemned in some situations but expected in others. Being visibly drunk during the day or at inappropriate times was shameful. But at a symposium or religious festival, it was socially acceptable, even encouraged, as a way to honor Dionysus, the god of wine. Violence was common and accepted at levels that would shock us today. Husbands regularly beat their wives. It was considered a man's right, not a crime. Slaves were whipped for minor offenses. Children were physically disciplined in ways that today would be seen as abuse. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated. It was often recommended as the right way to keep family order. Manuals on running a household or managing finances included advice on when and how to physically discipline wives, children, and slaves. A man who couldn't control his household was seen as weak and unfit. Punishment of slaves was brutal and institutionalized. A slave accused of theft or disobedience could be tortured to force a confession. Standard legal practice, not just punishment. A slave's testimony in court only counted if it was extracted under torture, based on the belief that only pain could bring out the truth from someone considered inherently dishonest. Violence wasn't limited to home life. Public brawls were frequent, especially in taverns or after symposia when drunk men roamed the streets. These fights sometimes led to serious injury or death, with little legal consequence if the victim was lower status. Speaking of slavery, about 1/3 of Athens's population were slaves. People treated as property, bought and sold, often brutally mistreated. Even if you survived your first day physically, your modern conscience would be shocked by these harsh social realities. Slavery in ancient Greece was everywhere, and very different from what you might imagine from more recent history. It wasn't based on race or skin color. Anyone could become a slave through war, piracy, unpaid debts, or by being born to a slave mother. Greek traders even enslaved fellow Greeks from other city-states without hesitation. Treatment of slaves varied widely. Some, especially those with valuable skills like craftspeople, accountants, or doctors, lived relatively decent lives and could sometimes buy their freedom. Others, especially those forced to work in mines or row galleys, faced brutal conditions and life expectancies measured in months, not years. Slavery was so deeply rooted in the Greek economy and society that even the most thoughtful philosophers rarely challenged the system itself. Aristotle believed some people were naturally slaves, meant only to serve. This acceptance of what we now see as a horrific system would be shocking to modern minds. Attitudes toward sexuality were equally unsettling. Older men often had relationships with teenage boys, something that was officially accepted in many Greek city-states. The idea of consent as we understand it today simply didn't exist back then. Women and slaves had almost no control over their own bodies. Pederasty, relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, was a complicated social institution, especially in places like Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. These relationships were formalized, with the older man, called the Erastes, acting as mentor and protector to the younger boy, the Eromenos. While these bonds included a sexual element, they were also educational and political, helping the young man enter adult social circles. Although they followed specific social rules, these relationships completely violated today's ideas of consent and child protection. The boys involved were usually between 12 and 18 years old. At a time when legal adulthood and the idea of consent didn't exist, social pressure, power imbalances, and cultural norms made true consent basically meaningless. For women, especially those who were citizens, sexuality was tightly controlled. A woman's main value was in her virginity before marriage and her faithfulness afterward. Wives caught cheating faced harsh punishments like divorce and social rejection. Meanwhile, men were free to have sexual relations with prostitutes, slaves, or, in some cases, other men and boys without social consequences. If you were a woman, especially without a male relative accompanying you, being seen out at night could seriously ruin your reputation. Respectable women rarely appeared in public without an escort, and never after dark, unless they were slaves, prostitutes, or extremely poor. In ancient Greece, especially in Athens, a respectable woman was essentially expected to stay out of public sight. A respectable Athenian woman from a good family only went out for specific occasions, like religious festivals, always accompanied by male relatives or slaves. This level of seclusion was so strict that a famous Athenian speaker once said, "We keep courtesans for pleasure, concubines for daily bodily needs, and wives to bear legitimate children and guard the home faithfully." While this might have been exaggerated for effect, it reflects real attitudes about women's roles, mainly confined to the household. The contrast with modern female freedom would be shocking. A modern woman, used to independence, a career, and freedom to move about, would find life as a woman in ancient Greece utterly suffocating. Constant surveillance, limits on movement, and lack of personal agency would be mentally devastating. As night fell, you'd realize that staying alive physically was just one part of the struggle. Navigating the complex social rules of ancient Greece, with values so different from your own, would be equally exhausting. Greek cities were socially complex. A person's status depended on many things: citizenship, gender, wealth, family, job, age, each with its own expectations and limits. Without knowing the unwritten rules, an outsider would have a tough time fitting in. Even among citizens, there were important differences. The well-born eupatridae from aristocratic families held higher social positions than regular citizens. Despite having the same political rights on paper, new citizens, or those with only one Athenian parent, faced subtle but ongoing discrimination. Artisans and merchants, though citizens, were often looked down on by wealthy landowners. The patronage system, called prostasia, made social relations even more complicated. Lower status citizens often depended on the protection and support of powerful patrons. These relationships formed complicated networks of obligations, favors, and loyalties that outsiders would struggle to understand. Not knowing the social norms could quickly lead to being ostracized, or worse, actions that seem normal today, like a woman speaking directly to strangers, questioning religious beliefs, or disrespecting authority, could lead to serious consequences, from social exile to legal punishment. Night fully set in and you returned to your home. If you were lucky, it was a modest house. If not, maybe just a shared space with other workers or slaves. Homes in ancient Greece varied a lot, but most urban people had very limited living space. A typical lower or middle-class Athenian family lived in just a few rooms, often less than 50 square meters total. Privacy was almost non-existent. Parents, kids, and often domestic slaves shared the same spaces for everything. Houses were built with different priorities than today. Personal comfort was secondary, and practicality and modest social display mattered most. Even wealthier citizens had few furnishings, mostly storage chests, simple benches, low tables, and sleeping mats. The idea of rooms for specific uses, like bedrooms or dining rooms, was found only in the richest homes. For lower status workers, or non-domestic slaves, that kind of specialization didn't exist. Many lived in small rented apartments in multi-story buildings in neighborhoods like the Sulai, with several families or individuals sharing one room. Others stayed in employer-provided lodgings, often just a sleeping area attached to a workshop or shop. There was no electric lighting. Darkness was only broken by the dim yellow glow of oil lamps or wax candles. The light was so weak that activities like reading or detailed work were basically impossible after dark. Greeks generally went to bed at dusk and rose with the sun, following natural daylight. Their oil lamps were small ceramic vessels with a spout for the wick, fueled by olive oil. While clever, these lamps gave off light about as bright as a single modern candle, casting flickering shadows and a lot of smoke. Fuel for lamps was expensive for ordinary families, so they only used it when absolutely necessary. Darkness wasn't just inconvenient, it shaped every part of life. Evening conversations happened in the gloom, with faces barely visible. Movements were careful to avoid trips and falls. Tasks that needed good eyesight, like sewing, writing, or crafting, were almost impossible after dark unless absolutely necessary, since lighting was expensive. This limitation had a big impact on culture and learning. Literacy, already limited to a privileged few, was further restricted by the difficulty of reading at night. Even educated citizens often relied on memorization and oral tradition because reading under poor lighting was so hard. Cold set in, especially during winter. There was no central heating. The lucky ones had a brazier, a metal container burning coal or wood that provided some warmth but also carried the constant risk of fire or carbon monoxide poisoning in poorly ventilated rooms. Although the Mediterranean climate was milder than northern Europe's, winters could still be harsh. Winter nights in Athens often dropped below 40 Fahrenheit, and it was even colder in the mountains. Without proper insulation, central heating, or glass windows, houses became very cold. Braziers were dangerous, not only due to fire risk in mostly wooden homes, but also because indoor burning released carbon monoxide, a deadly odorless gas. Many deaths we would now recognize as carbon monoxide poisoning were likely seen as divine intervention or natural death during sleep. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it caused serious health problems. Respiratory infections were common in winter and often developed into deadly pneumonia, especially before antibiotics. Cold and damp worsened arthritis and other inflammatory conditions. The most vulnerable, old people and children, often didn't survive the winter, a reality accepted as part of life's natural cycle. You prepared to sleep on the same hard mat or straw mattress you had woken up on. There were no spring mattresses, memory foam, or even proper bed frames for most people. Pillows, if any, were cloth bags stuffed with straw, feathers if you were wealthy, or sometimes pieces of wood. Sleeping surfaces in ancient Greece ranged from simple woven reed mats laid on the floor to kline, raised wooden frames with leather or rope straps supporting thin mattresses filled with straw, wool, or, for the richest, feathers. These surfaces didn't support the spine well, causing chronic back and neck pain for many adults. Besides physical discomfort, these sleeping setups rarely offered privacy. In typical homes, family members often shared the same sleeping area. Sometimes, domestic slaves slept in the same room as their owners, usually on the floor near the door. The idea of a private bedroom was nearly non-existent for most people. Sleeping positions were also different from modern norms. Instead of lying flat, many Greeks slept partially propped up, almost sitting, especially those with breathing or digestion issues. This position was thought to be healthier according to medical beliefs of the time, even if it was less comfortable. Insects shared your bed. Fleas, bedbugs, and lice. These unpleasant but unavoidable companions had no effective insecticides to keep them away, only aromatic herbs that gave temporary relief. Itchy bites were constant and inevitable. Parasite infestations were so widespread they were considered a normal part of life. Archaeologists have found fine combs for removing lice and nits in nearly every ancient Greek site. Medical texts describe treatments for skin worms and other parasites in detail. Bedbugs were especially troublesome. These blood-feeding insects hid in cracks during the day and came out at night to feed on people. Their bites caused painful welts and intense itching. Severe infestations could cause anemia from chronic blood loss, especially in children. The only way to control them, boiling all bedding regularly and exposing furniture to high heat, was impractical for most. Fleas spread diseases like typhus and possibly bubonic plague. Their life cycles were supported by domestic animals, dogs, cats, rats, that lived alongside people. Trying to sleep while constantly bothered by these pests would be miserable for anyone used to modern, mostly pest-free homes. Security was weak. Doors had simple locks that were easy to break. Windows rarely had strong barriers. Theft and break-ins were common, especially in crowded urban neighborhoods. Ancient locks, while clever for their time, offered little security by today's standards. They used wooden pins moved by a key, early versions of pin tumbler locks, but could be forced open or picked by skilled thieves. Windows rarely had glass, which was a costly luxury. Instead, openings were covered with fabric, wooden shutters, or left open for airflow, making break-ins easier. In colder areas, windows might be covered with mica or treated animal hides to let some light in while blocking wind. Physical security depended more on community watchfulness and people being around than on strong barriers. In small communities, everyone knew each other, and strangers were quickly noticed and watched. But in bigger cities, anonymity made crime easier, especially in poor, crowded areas. The sounds of night were very different from what you're used to. No constant hum of machines, no distant engines or sirens. Instead, you'd hear human voices, street calls, rats scurrying, and sometimes screams, whether of joy, pain, or fear. The nighttime soundscape of ancient life would feel very strange to modern ears. Without the constant background noise we associate with modern life, the electric buzz, the white noise from HVAC systems, or distant traffic, there was deep silence punctuated by isolated natural sounds, made louder by the dark. In cities, most noise came from people, voices traveling across distances, occasional arguments or singing from drinkers leaving taverns, cries of babies, groans of the sick or injured. Animals were always heard. Stray dogs barking in packs, rats squeaking, and other rodents thriving in dirty conditions. Occasionally, horses would neigh or donkeys bray. In stables, without modern noise, sounds traveled farther at night. Conversations could be overheard through thin walls. Activities in nearby houses were audible. Privacy in sound was almost non-existent. This open sound environment meant that nighttime events, domestic arguments, births, deaths, became communal experiences, fueling shared fears. Without modern science, night brought superstitious terrors, spirits, demons, curses. For the ancient Greeks, these were very real dangers, not just stories. Protective amulets were worn devoutly. Prayers and offerings to the gods were made with genuine hope for safety during the vulnerable hours of darkness. The ancient world was alive with supernatural forces. Everything, from crop growth to sudden illnesses, storms, or unexpected encounters, was seen as the work of gods, spirits, or mystical powers. This wasn't ignorance in the modern negative sense, but a consistent way to make sense of a reality that was often confusing and unpredictable. Night, with its thick darkness, was especially linked to chthonic gods, underground spirits, and potentially harmful forces. Hecate, goddess of crossroads, witchcraft, and necromancy, was closely connected to the night. People regularly left offerings at crossroads to appease her and ensure safe passage. Protective amulets were almost universal. The famous Greek evil eye to ward off bad luck, stylized phalluses to repel evil, and various symbols tied to specific gods. These were far more than decorations. They were seen as real protections against invisible but very real dangers. To a modern mind, used to scientific explanations for nature, the idea of living in a world where every shadow might hide a spirit, every strange noise could be a divine warning, and every illness might come from a curse or angry god would be mentally unsettling. The constant fear of supernatural forces caused significant stress and anxiety. You try to sleep, but it's very uncomfortable. Your body, not used to hard bedding, protests. Strange sounds keep you alert. The heat or cold, depending on the season, feels unbearable. Exhaustion eventually wins, but your sleep is restless and broken. Sleep in ancient times rarely looked like the solid 7 or 8 hours we expect today. Historical evidence shows the most common pattern was biphasic sleep. A longer first period after dusk, then an hour or more awake at midnight, followed by a second sleep until sunrise. During that midnight awake time, people often did quiet things, soft talking, praying, thinking, or visiting neighbors who were also awake. This pattern matched the natural human rhythm before artificial light and followed the solar cycle. But physical comfort during sleep was much worse than today. Besides hard surfaces and pests, problems like snoring, sleep apnea, and teeth grinding went untreated. Chronic insomnia was usually blamed on supernatural causes or body imbalances and treated with questionable remedies. Sedative herbs or amulets under the pillow. Sleep quality was also shaped by ancient diets and lifestyles. Heavy late afternoon meals, wine before bed, and a natural cycle of hard physical work followed by rest-affected sleep in ways unfamiliar to most modern people who live more sedentary lives. Getting through your first day was tough, but the real challenge was surviving weeks, months, or years in an environment hostile to the modern body and mind. Think of the ongoing challenges beyond just staying alive. Psychological adaptation, probably the hardest part, the constant feeling of being out of place, no shared culture or way to express complex feelings. This isolation would be deeply disorienting for social beings like humans. Physical injuries would leave permanent damage without proper medical care. Every wound, no matter how small, could cause lasting scars. Lost teeth wouldn't be replaced. Broken bones would heal poorly, causing chronic pain and less mobility. Repeated infections would weaken your immune system over time. Constant exposure to germs might build some resistance if you survived the first wave, but at the cost of overall health. Chronic parasites in your gut would drain essential nutrients. Ongoing low-level infections would keep your body inflamed all the time, speeding up aging and early organ decline. Even mild chronic malnutrition would have serious long-term effects. Undiagnosed vitamin deficiencies would cause diseases like scurvy, rickets, beriberi, or pellagra. These conditions, easily prevented today, would cause permanent damage over time. Your life expectancy, even if you survived the early adjustment period, would be much lower than modern standards. Aside from acute infections, the combined effects of constant physical stress, poor nutrition, lack of effective medical care, and environmental hazards would shorten your lifespan by decades. If, by some miracle, you survived the first days in ancient Greece, and adjusted to the physical hardships, you'd still face the harshest reality: disease. Life expectancy at birth was about 28 years. That number shocks modern sensibilities but must be understood in context. High infant mortality pulled the average way down. If you made it through childhood, you might live into your 40s or 50s, still a short life by today's standards. Infant mortality was devastating. About 30% of children died before their first birthday, and half never reached adulthood. The main causes were infectious gut and respiratory diseases, childbirth complications, malnutrition, and accidents. Child death was so common that parents often waited weeks or months before naming or celebrating a baby's birth, unsure if the child would survive. Studies of Greek skeletons show signs of chronic nutritional stress, lines in bones marking growth interruptions, enamel defects indicating disease or malnutrition during tooth development, and average heights much shorter than modern people in the same region. Bones also show high rates of early arthritis, especially in the spine, hips, and knees, evidence of extreme physical wear from constant manual labor. Poorly healed fractures were common, as were signs of chronic bone infections, osteomyelitis, that would have caused debilitating pain for years or even decades. Diseases we now treat easily were often fatal back then. A simple respiratory infection could turn into deadly pneumonia. An infected wound could lead to septicemia and death within days. Appendicitis was almost always fatal. Pneumonia, often called the old person's friend before antibiotics, was a leading cause of death in all cities. A simple cold or flu could easily develop into a secondary bacterial lung infection, causing high fever, severe breathing difficulties, and often death from lack of oxygen or heart failure. Treatments we take for granted today, like antiseptic cleaning, antibiotics, and sterile dressings, didn't exist. Gangrene was so common it was seen almost as a natural cause of death after serious injuries. Tetanus, with a near 100% death rate without modern care, was a constant threat to farmers and anyone working with soil. Conditions we now fix with surgery: appendicitis, strangulated hernias, intestinal blockages, complicated gallstones or kidney stones, were basically death sentences. Even when surgeries were attempted, limited anatomical knowledge, primitive techniques, no proper anesthesia, and inevitable infections after surgery led to extremely high mortality rates. Epidemics regularly swept through Greek cities, driven by poor sanitation. The plague that hit Athens early in the Peloponnesian War, 430–426 BC, killed about a quarter of the population, including the respected leader Pericles. Historians still debate the exact disease behind this devastation: typhus, smallpox, or even a viral hemorrhagic fever. Thucydides, who survived the plague himself, described symptoms like high fever, severe inflammation of the eyes and throat, bleeding from the tongue and genitals, violent coughing, vomiting, diarrhea, and finally gangrene in the limbs. Survivors often went blind, suffered memory loss, or permanent neurological damage. Crowded cities, poor sanitation, and lack of knowledge about how diseases spread made ancient cities especially vulnerable. During severe outbreaks, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried or burned, which only made the contagion worse. The social and psychological impact was huge. Thucydides wrote how social norms broke down. People abandoned the sick out of fear. Burial rituals were ignored, and moral behavior collapsed as Athenians lived for the moment, convinced they could die at any time. There were no vaccines. Diseases like measles, mumps, rubella, and smallpox were common. Almost everyone caught them, usually as children, and many didn't survive. Those who did often carried lifelong scars. Smallpox especially left permanent facial scars, blinded survivors, and killed 20–30% of those infected. Evidence of smallpox has been found in ancient Egyptian mummies. It continued killing millions annually until its global eradication in 1980, one of modern medicine's greatest achievements. Before vaccines, measles had a death rate of 5–15%, with complications like pneumonia, brain inflammation, and blindness, especially deadly when introduced to populations with no prior exposure, such as Native Americans after European contact. Diphtheria, with its throat membrane that could suffocate children, and tetanus causing agonizing muscle spasms and respiratory paralysis, were also feared until vaccines in the 20th century made them preventable. Women faced an additional danger: childbirth. Without modern obstetric techniques or safe cesarean sections, early versions existed but were almost always fatal without antibiotics. Giving birth was extremely risky. About 1 in 10 women died from childbirth or related complications like puerperal fever. Many survivors suffered permanent injuries, like obstetric fistulas. Births happened at home, helped by midwives, older women who passed down practical knowledge orally. While often skilled within their limits, they had few resources for serious problems. Abnormal fetal positions, breech, face first or transverse, usually caused obstructed labor, a life-threatening emergency for mother and baby without modern surgery. Forceps, which weren't developed until the 10th century, weren't available. Postpartum hemorrhage, heavy bleeding after birth, was another leading cause of maternal death. Without synthetic oxytocin, blood transfusions, or surgical techniques to stop bleeding, women could bleed to death within hours after what seemed like a successful delivery. Puerperal fever, infection after childbirth, was perhaps the most feared complication, showing up days later with high fever, severe belly pain, and often deadly septicemia. Parasitic diseases were everywhere. Analyses of ancient feces and mummies show that nearly everyone carried tapeworms, pinworms, hookworms, and other intestinal parasites. These parasites slowly drained people's energy, causing chronic anemia and weakening their immune systems. Intestinal parasites were more than just an annoying problem. They were a major cause of long-term illness. Tapeworms could grow several meters long, competing for nutrients and sometimes causing dangerous blockages. Hookworms attached to the intestinal walls and sucked blood, leading to severe iron deficiency anemia, especially harmful for children and pregnant women. Schistosomiasis, caused by waterborne parasites, affected many Mediterranean populations. Parasites entered through the skin in contaminated water, traveled through the bloodstream, and settled in intestinal or urinary veins, causing chronic inflammation, organ scarring, and eventual organ failure. Tissue parasites like Trichinella, from undercooked pork, lodged in muscles, causing chronic pain, weakness, and sometimes fatal neurological or heart problems. Evidence of trichinosis has been found in Egyptian mummies and other ancient remains. Chronic parasite infestations had effects far beyond their direct symptoms. Constant immune activation drained the body's ability to fight other infections, and parasites competing for nutrients contributed to chronic malnutrition even when food seemed adequate. The result was a population weakened and vulnerable to acute diseases. Malaria was common in many parts of Greece, especially coastal and marshy areas. Seasonal outbreaks caused high fever, chills, severe anemia, and often death. The disease was so widespread that Greeks named it tertian or quartan fever, depending on the fever cycle. Every 48 hours for P. vivax or P. ovale, every 72 hours for P. malariae. The deadlier P. falciparum caused irregular fevers and could quickly lead to cerebral malaria and death. Malaria's impact was huge. During the hot, humid mosquito season, entire communities could be sick at once, crippling harvests and daily life. Some marshlands stayed uninhabited despite fertile soil because of the fear of swamp fever. The high frequency of the sickle cell trait in Mediterranean populations is thought to be an evolutionary adaptation, as carriers get partial protection against malaria. Tuberculosis, called consumption, was another relentless killer. Without antibiotics, it slowly wore down patients with chronic cough, fever, weight loss, and eventually respiratory failure. Tuberculosis has plagued humans for thousands of years. Evidence appears in prehistoric skeletons and Egyptian mummies. In ancient Greece, Hippocratic physicians described it carefully, noting it mostly affected young adults and followed a slow, steady course. Persistent, low-grade fever, night sweats, worsening cough, extreme weakness, and dramatic weight loss gave rise to the name consumption, since it seemed to consume the body from inside. The pale, gaunt look of sufferers, with rosy cheeks during fever, was so distinctive it was romanticized in art and literature as tragic beauty. Tuberculosis also carried a social stigma. Known to be contagious even before germs were understood, sufferers were often socially isolated, adding psychological pain to physical suffering. Your modern body, never exposed to many of these germs and lacking lifetime-built immunity, would be extremely vulnerable to diseases that an ancient Greek might survive or recover from. These could easily be fatal for you. This difference in vulnerability is well documented in historical encounters between previously isolated groups. When Europeans met Native Americans or Polynesians, diseases like measles, smallpox, and flu, manageable for Europeans, wiped out whole communities with mortality rates of 50–90%. Your modern immune system, while naive to some ancient pathogens, wouldn't suffer the long-term damage caused by chronic parasites, malnutrition, and repeated infections that plagued ancient Greeks. Still, without prior exposure, you'd face an intense immune challenge, potentially overwhelming your defenses. Some researchers suggest that ancient urban growth created hotspots for new infectious diseases, as dense human and animal populations lived in unsanitary conditions, perfect for diseases jumping species and evolving. You might face disease strains unknown today, but to which locals had developed generational resistance. And if you survived, life would leave its marks. Lost teeth wouldn't be replaced. Broken bones would heal crookedly. Scars from diseases like smallpox would permanently mar your skin. Malnutrition during tough times would cause lasting damage. Vitamin deficiencies would cause conditions like rickets and scurvy. The accumulated physical wear and tear of a lifetime showed on almost every adult. Studies of ancient Greek skeletons reveal consistent patterns. Multiple healed but often misaligned fractures, repetitive stress marks where tendons attach, early arthritis in weight-bearing joints, and severely worn or missing teeth. Facial and body scars were so common they were barely noticed. Wounds, burns, diseases like smallpox, and even ritual or medical scarification, such as skin cuts during bloodletting, covered many adults' bodies. Without reconstructive surgery, every serious injury left a permanent mark. Progressive tooth loss was nearly universal. Without effective treatment for cavities or gum disease, most adults lost multiple teeth over their lives. Besides pain and infections, tooth loss seriously hurt nutrition, limiting the ability to chew tougher, more nutritious foods like whole grains, nuts, and firm meats. Chronic nutritional deficiencies left visible lasting signs. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, resulted in bowed legs and pelvic deformities, especially dangerous for women during childbirth. Scurvy, from vitamin C deficiency, led to receding gums, loose teeth, and slow wound healing. Niacin deficiency caused dermatitis, diarrhea, and eventually dementia, the classic symptoms of pellagra. Aging in ancient Greece was fast and harsh. Without glasses, many lost near vision by middle age. Without modern dentures, tooth loss made eating progressively harder. Without medications to manage chronic diseases like high blood pressure or diabetes, these quietly damaged vital organs until failure. The aging process started much earlier than what we're used to seeing today. Physical signs we now associate with old age, wrinkled skin, gray hair, a stooped posture, and limited mobility, often showed up in people as young as their 30s. This early aging was caused by a mix of hard physical labor, constant sun exposure, ongoing nutritional stress, and the cumulative effects of multiple infections over a lifetime. Vision problems were nearly universal as people got older. Presbyopia, the difficulty focusing on close objects, affected almost everyone by their 40s. Without glasses, this normal part of aging basically ended the ability to do detailed work like sewing, writing, or fine craftsmanship. Cataracts, which developed earlier due to intense sun exposure, eventually caused complete blindness for many elderly people. Chronic conditions we now manage with medication were left untreated and progressed naturally. Undiagnosed high blood pressure caused ongoing damage to the heart, brain, and kidneys, often leading to strokes or heart failure. Diabetes, known to the ancients by symptoms like sweet urine and extreme thirst, progressed relentlessly, causing vascular problems, blindness, gangrene, and death. Osteoporosis was especially devastating for older women. After menopause, without hormone therapy or calcium and vitamin D supplements, bone loss sped up dramatically. Hip fractures, common among elderly women with osteoporosis, were essentially death sentences back then. The combination of forced immobility, secondary pneumonia, and blood clots led to death in most cases. By age 40, the average Greek man or woman often looked what we'd consider 60 or 70 today. A body worn from physical labor, skin aged by the sun, missing teeth, poor eyesight, and joints aching from early arthritis. Archaeological evidence supports this early aging. Skeletons of people in their 40s often show joint wear, bone loss, and other degenerative changes similar to much older modern individuals. This difference reflects not only harder physical work, but also the cumulative impact of infections, chronic inflammation, and poor nutrition. Throughout life, visible signs of aging were no less dramatic. Without sunscreen, moisturizers, dental care, hair dyes, or any modern products to slow visible aging, middle-aged people showed deep wrinkles, heavy sunspots, fully gray hair or advanced baldness, and often partial or complete tooth loss. The modern idea of middle age, as a long period of good health between youth and old age, simply didn't exist. The switch from being productive to frail was often sudden, triggered by serious illness or injury. Someone might be working one day and become permanently disabled the next from an accident or disease that today would be treatable. Social views on old age were also quite different. While elders were often respected for their wisdom, especially in oral traditions, there was a clear expectation that they keep contributing as long as they physically could. There was no official retirement. People simply worked until they couldn't anymore, gradually adjusting to their reduced abilities. If you managed to survive the diseases, you still faced another constant challenge: hunger. Food insecurity was a harsh reality for most ancient Greeks. Farming depended entirely on the weather. Drought, too much rain, or insect infestations could wipe out entire crops. There were no modern irrigation systems, fertilizers, or pesticides. Harvests were often poor, and famine was always a threat. Crop yields in ancient Greece were far lower than what modern farming achieves. It's estimated that wheat and barley, the staple grains, produced only about 1/10 of the yield per hectare compared to modern agriculture. This low productivity came from many factors: unimproved seed varieties, basic farming methods, simple hand tools and reliance on animal power without machines. Limited arable land was another ongoing problem. Greece's mountainous, rocky terrain offered relatively little soil suitable for intensive farming. Only about 20% of the peninsula was farmable, forcing many city-states to import grain from more fertile regions like Egypt, Sicily, and the Black Sea area. The food system's fragility was worsened by dependence on just a few crops. Wheat and barley dominated farming, with olives and grapes rounding out the classic Mediterranean trio. This lack of diversity meant that when a major crop failed, there were few alternatives to make up the loss. Extreme weather events that modern farming can usually handle, thanks to irrigation, drainage, and technology, often led to disasters back then. Multi-year droughts, documented in historical records, caused widespread famine. Floods could destroy current harvests, along with stored seeds and fertile soil, ruining multiple growing seasons. Food storage was primitive. Grains, the diet's cornerstone, were kept in large ceramic jars, pythoi, or silos. Despite efforts, pests, rats, weevils, and other insects devoured much of the stock, and mold spoiled even more. Up to 20% of stored food was lost before it could be eaten. Common grain storage methods included large ceramic jars partially buried to keep temperatures stable, underground clay-lined silos, and ventilated granaries. Clever designs, but still offering limited protection against moisture, pests, and spoilage. To fight grain pests like weevils, people mixed ashes, natural earth powders, or certain repellent herbs with the stored grain. These methods helped only a little, and it was accepted that part of the grain would be lost to insects or contain eggs and larvae eaten along with the food. Rodents were a constant threat to food supplies. Cats were kept specifically to control rats, and traps were used, but losses remained significant. The problem was so widespread that it took on a religious aspect. Offerings were regularly made to Apollo Smintheus, literally Apollo of the mice, to ask for protection against these grain-eating pests. Microbial spoilage, especially mold growth, was another big challenge. Without knowledge of microorganisms, people learned through experience that grains stored in dry, well-ventilated places lasted longer. Still, the Mediterranean climate, with its wet winters, often created perfect conditions for mold, leading to contamination by potentially deadly mycotoxins. Most ancient Greeks had a pretty monotonous diet that often didn't provide enough calories or essential nutrients. Their staple food was massa, a kind of porridge or bread made from barley. Wheat, which was prized for making lighter bread, was more expensive and usually reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Masa, the basic food for most people, was made by mixing barley flour with water and sometimes a bit of olive oil or wine for flavor. It could be a thick porridge or a dough shaped into flat cakes and baked or grilled. This staple was eaten at nearly every meal and was the main source of calories. Wheat bread was lighter and considered superior, an obvious status symbol. It required not only more expensive grain but also more processing. Wheat needed to be milled finer than barley, and the dough had to ferment properly to make good bread. In tough times, even better-off families went back to barley, saving wheat for special occasions or privileged members. The diet's monotony was occasionally broken by seasonal changes. Spring brought fresh vegetables and wild herbs. Summer and fall offered fruits and nuts, while winter often meant relying on stored grains, olives and brine, hard cheeses and dried fruits. This seasonal diet was much more extreme than what we're used to today with year-round availability. Food was mostly local and seasonal out of necessity, not choice. The main exception was cities with strong sea trade, where imported foods, grain from Egypt or the Black Sea, dates from Phoenicia, or spices from faraway places, were available, but usually only affordable for the wealthy. Protein was scarce. Meat was a rare treat for ordinary people, mostly eaten during religious festivals when animals were sacrificed. Fish was more common in coastal areas but still not an everyday food for many. Legumes, like lentils and fava beans, provided most of the protein in the daily diet. Eating meat was closely tied to religious practices. Most animals slaughtered for food were first offered to the gods, and the meat was then shared among participants. These sacrifices mainly happened during festivals, so even middle-class people might go weeks or months without meat. Domesticated animals, goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle, were mostly valued for their ongoing products like milk, wool, and labor, not for meat. Killing an animal was a big loss, and only done on special occasions, or when the animal was too old or sick to be useful. Fish, more available near the coast, was socially divided. Large, fresh fish were luxuries for the rich, while small fish like anchovies and sardines, often salted, were affordable protein for the middle and lower classes. Inland areas prized salted or dried fish as a trade item because it could be preserved. Legumes such as lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, and peas made up the main protein source for most people, usually cooked into thick soups with onions, garlic, and herbs. These humble foods were actually more nutritious than many rich people's meals, providing complementary proteins when eaten with grains. Nutritional deficiencies were common. Lack of vitamin C caused scurvy, leading to bleeding gums and wounds that wouldn't heal. Vitamin D deficiency, especially for those working mostly indoors like weavers, artisans, and household slaves, caused rickets and weak bones. Iron deficiency anemia was widespread, especially among women of childbearing age. Scurvy, from vitamin C deficiency, was particularly common in winter and early spring when fresh fruits and veggies were scarce. Symptoms like bleeding gums, loose teeth, non-healing wounds, joint pain, and extreme tiredness were recognized but not understood. Some communities found folk remedies, like eating sprouts and shoots rich in vitamin C. Vitamin D deficiency hit certain groups hard in late winter, despite the sunny Mediterranean climate that should have allowed plenty of natural vitamin D production. People working mostly indoors often suffered muscle weakness and bone pain, and children developed rickets with skeletal deformities. Iron deficiency anemia was nearly universal among women of reproductive age, caused by poor dietary iron combined with menstrual blood loss and frequent pregnancies. Archaeological studies show high rates of cribroorbitallia and porotic hyperostosis, bone signs of chronic anemia in female skeletons. This deficiency led to chronic fatigue, impaired thinking, less work capacity, and greater risk of infection. Pellagra, from niacin, vitamin B3 deficiency, showed up as dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. It was especially common in populations relying heavily on maize without traditional processing methods. The neuropsychiatric symptoms were often mistaken for possession or madness. Endemic goiter, caused by iodine deficiency, was common in inland areas far from the sea. The thyroid gland would enlarge, sometimes forming big neck lumps, and was so widespread in some places it was considered normal. Cretinism, a severe congenital condition from maternal iodine deficiency during pregnancy, led to permanent mental retardation and stunted growth. Seasonal hunger was a harsh reality. The toughest time, known as the hunger season, typically lasted from late winter to early spring, when last year's food stores ran low and the new harvest wasn't ready yet. During these months, many survived on drastically reduced rations, eating wild herbs, roots, and almost anything that provided some nutrition. The hunger season usually occurred between February and May, depending on the region, as stored autumn grain ran out and new crops were still months away. Seasonal weight loss was expected. Many adults lost 5–10% of their body weight during this tough time. Survival strategies included intensive gathering of edible wild plants like wild chicory, wild asparagus, young nettles, dandelion, and other early spring herbs and greens. Wild greens weren't just a desperate fallback. They were an important part of how people adapted culturally to the yearly cycle of scarcity. Certain hunger foods were known and used only as a last resort. Acorns, bitter but nutritious, were soaked in water to remove tannins and then ground into flour. The inner bark of some pine trees was processed to extract nutrients. Coastal communities relied on wild tubers, many slightly toxic, which were carefully prepared to remove harmful parts. Marine resources offered some relief during hard times. Shellfish, sea urchins, and small coastal fish could be collected, even when bad weather made deep-sea fishing impossible. Though not always preferred, these foods provided crucial nutrition when other sources ran out. The biological impact of this seasonal hunger was significant. Archaeological evidence shows Harris lines in long bones, signs of temporary growth pauses that often lined up with the hunger season. Children born during or soon after these periods tended to have lower birth weights and higher infant mortality, setting a pattern of disadvantage that lasted their whole lives. The worst famines happened occasionally and were devastating. During the Peloponnesian War, the blockade of Athens caused extreme shortages. During sieges, whole cities might be reduced to eating rats, boiled leather, and in documented extreme cases, even resorting to cannibalism. Catastrophic famines struck when multiple bad factors hit at once, usually crop failures from harsh weather, trade disruptions caused by war or piracy, and intentional destruction of food supplies as a war tactic. These crises could wipe out 20–30% of a population through death and lowered birth rates. Siege warfare was a method especially linked to extreme hunger. By completely surrounding a city and blocking supplies, attackers forced surrender by starvation. Conditions during long sieges became desperate fast, with rationing growing harsher. As usual, foods ran out. Historical accounts show a typical progression during severe famines. First, non-essential animals like horses and work animals were eaten. Then, items usually considered inedible. Boiled leather from shoes and belts, parchment, grass, and tree bark were consumed. In the final stage, cases of cannibalism were reported, usually starting with eating the corpses of the dead, before possibly moving to more active forms. Extreme famines often brought social collapse. Normal food distribution systems failed, leading to looting, violence, and a breakdown of social norms. Survivor stories describe how family and community bonds fell apart under the pressure of hunger, with parents unable to feed their children, the elderly abandoned, and nearly every cultural taboo broken. As starvation worsened, famine's demographic effects lasted for generations. Besides death tolls, survivors often suffered permanent reproductive damage, causing lower fertility for years after the crisis. Children who suffered severe malnutrition during critical growth stages often never fully regained their physical and mental potential. Even in normal times, food distribution was very unequal. Wealthy citizens enjoyed lavish banquets with a variety of meats, fish, fruits, and vegetables, while the poor, making up most of the population, lived on the bare minimum to survive. Food inequality was built into society and very visible. Elite banquets, called symposia, featured elaborate spreads, including exotic meats, fresh fish and seafood, imported fruits, and aged wines, served by specialized slaves. This was a sharp contrast to common citizens and free lower-class workers who mostly ate mesa, bread, barley porridge, legumes, onions, garlic, and sometimes small amounts of cheese, olives, or salted fish. Fresh meat was eaten only a few times a year during religious festivals, when animals were sacrificed and the meat distributed to slaves. For slaves, the situation was even harsher. Domestic slaves in wealthy households might get a reasonably adequate, if monotonous, diet, but those working in mines or rural estates usually received only the minimum to keep working, mostly barley rations, low-quality olives, and sometimes watered-down wine. This food inequality wasn't just about preference or luxury. It had real consequences for health and lifespan. Archaeological evidence shows clear differences in height, bone density, and life expectancy between social classes, partly due to nutrition. Skeletons of high-status people often show better bone development and fewer signs of nutritional stress like enamel hypoplasia. The unequal food distribution got worse during shortages. When crops failed or supplies ran low, the less privileged suffered the most. Emergency food distribution, when it existed, usually favored citizens over non-citizens, city residents over rural ones, and upper classes over lower. Your modern body, used to 3 solid meals a day and convenient snacks, would find this reality deeply challenging. The constant feeling of hunger, repetitive diet, and the physical effort required, despite poor nutrition, would be a brutal test of your physical and mental endurance. Switching from a modern to an ancient diet would be tough on your body. Used to a steady supply of glucose from refined carbs and frequent meals, your metabolism would struggle. Reactive hypoglycemia, a sharp drop in blood sugar after going without food, would be a big problem until your body adjusted to intermittent eating. The amount of food you'd need to eat would also be very different. Modern diets tend to be calorie and nutrient dense, so you can meet your needs with smaller portions. But the ancient diet, mostly whole grains and legumes, required eating much larger volumes to get enough calories. Your stomach, not used to processing so much fiber and plant material, would likely cause discomfort, bloating, and gas at first. Your gut bacteria, the microbes in your digestive system, would go through a big shift. Modern research shows that big diet changes can alter gut flora within days. This shift might initially cause diarrhea, stomach pain, and poor nutrient absorption, making existing deficiencies worse during the transition. The mental toll of chronic hunger might be even harder to handle. Constant hunger isn't just physical discomfort. It impacts thinking, emotions, and social behavior. Studies on calorie restriction show that even moderate cuts in food intake can lead to obsessive thoughts about food, irritability, trouble focusing, and social withdrawal. All things that would seriously hurt your ability to function in an already tough environment. Surviving physically in ancient Greece would only be half the battle. The psychological shock of living in such a different world would be just as overwhelming for a modern mind. The first shock would be the information gap. You are used to having the world's knowledge at your fingertips. Smartphones, internet, instant news. In ancient Greece, information traveled at the speed of a messenger on foot or horseback. News from just a few miles away might take days to reach you. Events in far-off places might never reach you at all, or only come as distorted rumors months or years later. The difference between today's constant information overload and ancient scarcity would be deeply disorienting. In a world where news from nearby cities could take days to arrive, and news from distant lands came so distorted it was barely recognizable, the constant uncertainty would be mentally exhausting. The very nature of knowledge was different. Before printing, information was mostly passed down orally, with changes introduced over time. Memorization was prized over critical thinking, and knowledge was often encoded in verses or proverbs to help remember it. Written materials were extremely rare. Hand-copied books on papyrus or parchment were luxury items only the wealthy could access. Libraries, like the famous Library of Alexandria, held huge collections, but were only open to a small, educated elite. For most people, written knowledge was basically out of reach. Literacy itself was limited. Only about 10–30% of men and far fewer women in Athens could read and write. Beyond basic literacy, this created heavy reliance on middlemen to access written info, a filter that could distort the original message. The isolation would be crushing. There was no way to contact loved ones who weren't nearby. No photos to remember faces. No voice messages, no video calls. Relatives who moved to other cities might never be seen or heard from again. Loneliness had a much deeper meaning. Physical distance meant permanent disconnection. People who moved away, even to nearby cities, often lost touch with family and friends forever. Letters existed but depended on physical messengers. They were expensive, slow, and often unreliable. Without photography or any way to capture images, visual memories were all that remained after separation, and those memories faded over time. Parents might never see their kids grow up. Kids might forget what their parents looked like. This slow fading of visual connections was a kind of ongoing grieving rare in modern life. Long-distance communication was very limited emotionally. Letters, when possible, were usually formal, often dictated to scribes and read aloud by others. Facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language, the core of human communication, were completely missing. On a deeper level, the isolation also meant feeling cut off from anything familiar or understandable. Transported to ancient times, you'd feel out of place all the time, unable to share cultural references, jokes, values, or basic assumptions about how the world works. This deep alienation, with no one around who saw the world like you, would be profoundly lonely in a way few modern people experience. Boredom would be constant. No TV, radio, internet, or even easy access to books. The few books that did exist were expensive manuscripts, only for the educated and wealthy. Free time would mostly be spent talking, playing simple games, or stargazing. For a modern mind used to constant stimulation, this would be tough. But after all this, I hope you'll appreciate the good things we have today. Until the next video, sleep well.